Can you hear me? Okay, well, we'll do this as efficiently as possible, but we'll see what happens. So, in preparation for going through Samuel, we're sort of going through the last bit of Judges. We talked about the cycle, we talked about the decline of the Judges, and that leads us to the story of Samson. And last week, 2 weeks before, we talked about the prophecy of his birth, that it was a miraculous birth, that it was proposed by Christ himself, the angel of the Lord, and that this child would be blessed with the Holy Spirit pretty much from birth. So everything about this child sounds pretty special. This is going to be an almost messianic type individual. What we get is Samson. And this figure judged Israel for 20 years. So, since we're talking about Samson, it's only natural that we mention Bilbo Baggins, because the comparison is just so obvious, right? I had a friend at Criswell who told me that he had never seen the movie. And by the movie, I mean the animated movie, which is great. So he borrowed the movie, he watched the movie, and he came back and said he didn't like the movie. And those are fighting words. And I asked him why he didn't like the movie, and he said because the character was flat. Now, for those who don't know, there's a difference between flat characters and round characters. We could also call these two-dimensional characters versus three-dimensional characters, but those aren't exactly overlapping terms, but they're close enough. Basically, a round character or a three-dimensional character is someone who goes on a character arc. They go on an emotional journey, not just a physical journey. The character that they end up being is not the character they start out being. So there are many, many examples, and it doesn't have to be over just one story. It can be over a series of stories. So Luke Skywalker from episode 4 is not the same as he is in episode 6. He has grown, he has matured, his worldview has expanded. But then you get little Bilbo Baggins. Now, Bilbo Baggins, he outwits Gollum, he fights the spiders, he converses with dragons, and he even takes part in this war. And yet, the end of the story is he just wants to go home. He liked who he was at the beginning of the story. He essentially remains unchanged. That's because the story, at least the emotional journey, is not about Bilbo. It's actually about Thorin, the lost king of the dwarves. Thorin is motivated by greed and revenge and his lust for gold, wants to kill the dragon, and all of those things. And at the end of the story, he has gotten everything he wanted. The dragon is dead. He has his gold back. He has his crown back. But he is dying. And the end is just beautiful. He goes, "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sadder merry, I must leave it now forever," or farewell. Thorin is the one who learned something, right? Not Bilbo. Bilbo goes back, and he just goes back to being who he was. And it's a very great story. The point is, two-dimensional characters can be very effective when they're used correctly. Not every character needs this grand emotional journey. Keep all of that in mind as we go through the last chapter of Samson's story. So, it begins in verse 1 of chapter 16. Samson went to Gaza. Okay, so here's our map. You should be somewhat familiar with it. We have, very bottom, the dark green is Simeon, the lighter green is Judah, and then above Judah you have the tribes of Dan and Benjamin. Dan is the dark orange to the west. Benjamin is the kind of lighter orange to the east. They kind of separate Ephraim from Judah. The blue is Samson, where he grew up. The red is where his fiancée lived, right, from last time. The yellow to the east is Jerusalem, just so you have kind of a reference of all these locations. The purple territory is Philistia. That's where the Philistines have. So they've taken over the Judean coast, all right? And it stretches pretty much all along Judah up to the border of Dan. Gaza is that little green spot in the southwest, right? It's that little town at the very bottom. So that's where Samson went. Okay, so he's gone down to deep Philistine territory. That's good, right? He's going against those Philistines. He's going to give them what for. And no, he's visiting a prostitute. So that isn't quite what we should be expecting. So in verse 1, Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute and went to her. The Hebrew's a little ambiguous. My translation, the Holman, says he went to bed with her. That's a little interpretive. We're losing the ambiguity in this translation. We already know that women are a bit of a weakness for him. We saw that in the last story. It's amazing to me, the pastors, theologians, preachers, and so forth, who will go to great lengths to present Samson as a more positive character than he is. They will point out, just because he's hanging out with prostitutes doesn't mean he's doing anything bad. I mean, think about the 2 spies hanging out with Rahab. So maybe Samson's just down there doing reconnaissance. The next time, ladies, you catch your man hanging out with prostitutes, just know they're doing reconnaissance for Yahweh. Nothing suspicious going on. I'm not going to give Samson the benefit of the doubt on this. I think he's probably doing other things. We already know that as a Nazirite, he took a vow not to drink alcohol and not to touch dead bodies. Sleeping with prostitutes is not actually stated in the Nazirite vows, but the broader implication is don't do anything that would make you unclean. Being with prostitutes would definitely make you unclean. Even if it's not stated, this is probably something that would be frowned upon for one of the judges of Israel, but this is Samson, right? So in verse 2, when the Gazites heard that Samson was there, they surrounded the place and waited in ambush for him all that night at the city gate. While they were waiting quietly, they said, "Let us wait until dawn, then we will kill him." I don't know why they're waiting. Just attack in the middle of the night when his pants are down. I don't know, but they decide they're going to wait. So in verse 3, but Samson stayed in bed until midnight when he got up. Why did he get up? What caused him to get up? Why not? I don't know. This is a weird story. But he gets up at midnight, and he just decides, I'm going to leave. So in verse 3, he took hold of the doors of the city gate along with the 2 gateposts and pulled them out, bar and all. This adds so many questions. Usually the gates are connected to the gatehouse, where there are usually people manning the gatehouse to prevent people from sneaking in or invading or whatever. Why were there no guards? Did he kill the guards? Doesn't say. Why wouldn't they have sounded the alarm? Weren't the guys waiting outside? So why didn't they see him come outside? Some have speculated that maybe the prostitute's house was actually the gatehouse because Rahab, right, her house was near the gate. There's just not really enough to clarify all these points. But regardless, he tore the gate off of the gatepost. Why? I mean, this is just Samson. Samson does crazy stuff. He put them on his shoulders and took them to the top of the mountain overlooking Hebron. Now, again, the antics aside, like just the logistics of all of this, the reality of all of this, the message that he's sending is very clear, right? Why take their gate? This is clearly sending a message. You can't stop me. Your gates mean nothing to me. I can come and go as I please. You might as well not even have them. I mean, it's clearly a symbolic gesture to the Philistines that nothing they do is going to stop this guy. He is a force of nature. So we now enter into the last sort of saga of Samson. In verse 4, sometime later, he fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the Sorek Valley. So Sorek, for those of you who are not familiar with your Israel geography, the Sorek Valley is the valley that separates the territory of Dan from the territory of Judah. So it would be basically the same area that his fiancée lived. So it's this big valley, and on the north basically is Dan, on the south is Judah. But on the southern side is basically been occupied by the Philistines. So the southern part of the valley would be in the Philistine territory. Now we get to the fun, he's in love. We don't really know enough about Delilah. She's living in the Sorek Valley. There's been a lot of speculation that she might have been a Philistine. Her fiancé was a Philistine, so it makes sense. There's a lot of speculation that she might have been a prostitute. We already know that he hangs out with prostitutes. It doesn't say that she is, although she is bribed, so She's a woman who knows her price, although when you get the price, you may not hold it against her. Of course, it does say that he's in love. So is he really in love? Is he infatuated? We've seen how he treats women, so it's hard to put all that together necessarily. But in verse 5, the Philistine leaders went to her and said, "Persuade him to tell you where his great strength comes from so we can overpower him, tie him up, and make him helpless. Each of us will then give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So that's each of them are giving her 1,100. Look, everyone has a price. This is a good price. This is a lot of money. This is runaway to Fiji money, right? So that's a lot of money, and she is very, very quickly persuaded to agree with them. So in verse 6, so Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me, where does your great strength come from? How could someone tie you up and make you helpless?" Just typical pillow talk, right? Every woman asks her husband that. What can I do to tie you up? Samson told her, "If they tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I will become weak and be like any other man." The Philistine leaders brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him up with them. While the men in ambush were waiting in her room, she called out to him, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of yarn snaps when he touches fire. The secret of his strength remained unknown. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and said to me lies. Won't you please tell me how you can be tied up?" He told her, "If they tie me with new ropes that have never been used, I will become weak like any other man." Now, this one's interesting, right? Why is this one interesting? I told you last week, don't forget this, because it will become relevant next week. And you all forgot, didn't you? No one pays attention. Because we've already been told that he's been tied up with new rope, right? That's what they did. That's what when the Philistines went to the men of Judah and said, we want Samson, and the men of Judah go to Samson and say, "We're going to turn you over to the Philistines." They tied him up with brand new ropes. So we already know that new ropes aren't going to do anything. So in verse 12, Delilah took new ropes, tied him up with them, and shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But while the men in ambush were waiting in her room, he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Again, just as we'd expect. Verse 13, then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me all along and told me lies. Tell me how you can be tied up." He told her, "If you weave the 7 braids on my head with the web of a loom." So we've gone from bowstrings. I don't even know where the bowstrings come from, but bowstrings. Then we go to rope, which we already know won't work. Now we're transitioning to something to do with his hair. It's clear that he's slowly revealing, he's getting closer and closer to his weakness, right? So now he's giving her a hint. It has something to do with his hair. The loom thing seems like he's just totally messing with her, which we'll get to in a second. In verse 14, she fashioned the braids with a pin and called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are here." He awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin with the loom and the web. Of course, the loom is the thing you use to weave like rugs and clothes and stuff. So she weaved it into the hair, and then nothing happened. Verse 15, "How can you say I love you," she told him, "when your heart is not with me? This is the 3rd time you have mocked me and not told me what makes your strength so great." Because she nagged him day after day and pleaded with him until she wore him out. Oh boy. I'm getting kind of a deja vu on this, right? Haven't we kind of already seen this? There was a question, there was a woman involved, there was the whole, the riddle with the 30 groomsmen, and the men threatened his fiancée, and then the fiancée was like, "Why won't you tell me you love me, blah, 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 blah," and she nagged him and nagged him and nagged him. He finally gave in. Also, I'm going to remind you all that all Scripture is inspired and given for inspiration. So in verse 17, he told her the whole truth and said to her, "My hair has never been cut because I'm a Nazirite to God from birth. If I am shaved, my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man." So, Now we get to a fun question. So we've gone through the four, the bowstrings, the rope, the loom, and now he's told her to cut his hair. Why? Why tell her? So the first thing is we could just say he's stupid. He's just dumb. He's just a dumb man. I don't think so. I don't think that's it. Samson has proven to be impetuous. He tends to be led around by his desires. He's spoiled. We went over that last time. But he's not stupid. He seems to be fairly intelligent. He seems to be fairly clever. The riddles, and then he's had kind of a fun sort of mocking her with the loom thing. It just seems like it's just juvenile angst. So I don't think it's that he's stupid. We could go with that he's genuinely love, that he really does love her, and he really does trust her. But again, that seems to just tie in with the stupid part, that he's just an idiot. But I don't go with that either. There's probably some other options, but I just lean with, I think this is just hubris. So hubris is a great word. It comes from Greek. And we often misuse hubris or misunderstand what hubris is. Hubris is fantastic. Hubris is a sort of destructive pride. When you're so proud of something, so arrogant of something, that it blinds you to the obvious. It just kind of overwhelms you. One of my favorite examples of hubris is from the old Spartacus movie with Kirk Douglas. And the Spartacus has led the slave rebellion, and they're causing a general havoc. So the Romans send their first general, I can't remember his name, but he goes to confront the slaves, and they make a little camp next to where the slaves are, and they're going to go and attack the slaves in the morning. So in the middle of the night, the slaves sneak into the Roman camp, kill all the Romans, capture the general, and then send him back to Rome. So the Roman general is now standing in front of the Senate, and they're asking him. They're trying to figure out how this small little band of slaves could take out an entire Roman army, because that doesn't make any sense. He's like, well, they just walked into the camp and killed us all. How do you just walk into a Roman camp and kill everybody? So they ask him, well, did you make a wall around the camp? Oh, no, we didn't do that. Did you have guards around the camp? Oh, no, we didn't do that. Did you dig a moat around the camp? Oh, no, we didn't do that. They keep asking the question. Finally, they got did you put any kind of defensive measures around the camp? And the general goes, no. So one of the senators, all the senators are just going crazy. And they're like, well, why? Like, that's standard procedure, right? You protect your camp. And the general looks at them like they're crazy. And he goes, they were slaves. That's all he said. Like, that was his answer. They were slaves, so we didn't think, or at least I, the general, didn't think we needed to take defensive measures, which allowed the slaves just to walk into the camp and kill everybody. He was so arrogant, it didn't occur to him that the slaves would just walk in and kill them. Samson, right? We already know that as part of the Nazirite vow, you can't touch dead bodies. He's touched dead bodies. Nothing's happened. You can't drink alcohol. He's been partying with Philistines, drinking, doing drugs, God knows what else. Hasn't lost his strength. So what's a haircut going to do? Is God really going to abandon him because he gets a haircut? That's crazy. God hasn't abandoned him yet. He's the hero. He's the savior of Israel. I really think he thinks he's not going to lose his strength. He's broken all the other vows. So I think this all just comes down to hubris. He's not worried about it. So in verse 18, when Delilah realized that he had told her the whole truth, she sent this message to the Philistine leaders, "Come one more time, for he has told me the whole truth." The Philistine leaders came to her and brought the money with her. Then she let him fall asleep on her lap. Whoa. This is reminiscent of another story on Judges. A woman lures a man in, comforts him, lets him fall asleep. Who am I talking about? Jael and Sisera, right? The great villain that Barak is supposed to be fighting. And but he doesn't manage to capture him because Deborah says, you will not capture the enemy because God will take away the victory from you. So some random woman lures him into her tent, has him fall asleep, and then bashes his head in with a tent peg. Oh, it's a great story. He got the point. She penetrated his skull, as the Hebrew says. It is violent and it is graphic. Then she let him fall asleep on her lap and called a man to shave off the 7 braids on his head. In this way, she made him helpless and his strength left him. So that's the last vow that he had left. Then she cried, Samson, the Philistines are here. When he awoke from his sleep, he said, I will escape as I did before. He's not worried. Nothing's going to happen. And shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. So, yeah, not so much. They brought him down to Gaza. Right? Gaza's where he had been with the prostitute. That's where he had torn down those gates to make the point, right? That you are defenseless, that I can do whatever I want to your city because I am the great Samson. Well, they brought him down to Gaza to prove to him, right, that you are no different than a mule, a pack animal. So they tie him up to this, bound with bronze shackles. He was forced to grind grain in the prison. So they strapped him to one of these grinders that they would normally have like an animal pull, and they've got him pulling this millstone. Verse 22. I remember when I was younger, my pastor was going through the book of Judges. I don't remember much about his sermons, but this did make me stand out. And I've seen other commentaries talk about it, so he probably wasn't original to him, but it always stuck out with me. I think it was a great point, and I kind of want to make a habit of pointing it out. So in verse 22, but his hair began to grow back after it had been shaved. He said that if you had this strong man, this great Herculean type figure, and you find out that the weakness, the source of his strength is his hair, why in God's name would you not have a barber out there every day shaving this man's head? Pay him his weight in silver, but every day he would shave that guy's head. Hubris. Pride. He's already lost his strength, nothing to worry about. But the point of this verse is, and I think it's true, his hair is coming back. Right? Which, if his hair's coming back, and this is important enough, the Bible wants us to know this, right? It's pointing this out. Because we would just normally think just naturally, well, yeah, of course his hair will grow back. That's what hair does. But it wants us to know his hair is growing back. Because this has nothing to do with his hair. His hair doesn't matter, right? It was never about his hair. It's about his vows. God hasn't abandoned him. That's the point of this verse. The hair is inconsequential. So in verse 23, now the Philistine leaders gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon. They rejoiced and said, our God has handed over Samson to us. This is very reminiscent of when they captured the Ark of the Covenant, right? And they bring it in and all that fun stuff. Dagon is a fun god. We don't know a whole lot about him. He seems to have been a very popular god, but we don't have too many references. In Hebrew, Dagon means something like fishy. It's very likely that this was not what the Philistines called him because that's not a very good deity name. It's hard to pray to a god named Fishy. And it's not entirely clear what he is a god of. Because in Hebrew his name is Fishy, it's been long speculated that he was a sea god, like Poseidon or Neptune or something like that. However, most modern scholars, and you've probably heard sermons about the fishy, the Philistine sea god. Most modern scholars have rejected that. They think he was probably a harvest deity like Tammuz or Ninurta. But now we're seeing more scholars come out saying, no, he's probably more like a storm god, maybe like a Baal or a Zeus. We don't really know. We just don't know exactly. So when the people saw him, they praised their God and said, our God has handed over to us our enemy who destroyed our land and who multiplied the dead. So in verse 25, when they were drunk, which is never a good sign, they said, bring Samson here to entertain us. So they brought Samson from prison, and he entertained them. They had him stand between the pillars. Samson said to the young man, the young lad who was leading him by the hand, "Lead me to where I can feel the pillars supporting the temple so I can lean against them." The temple was full of men and women. All the leaders of the Philistines were there. About 3,000 men and women were on the roof watching Samson entertain them. He called out to the Lord, "Lord God, please remember me. Strengthen me, God, just once more." So, we're going to go a little over. I apologize. I think I was in my early 20s. I was a counselor at a youth camp going to Falls Creek. And I was there with a friend of mine. We were both counselors. And that week, we had a camp pastor, and he took us through the story of Samson. And I remember, as soon as he said, take us through Samson, taking us this huge, youth camp, all through the story of Samson, I remember just getting a shudder down my spine. Like, why? Why on earth would you take all these youth through the story of Samson? There are so many great stories you could take youth through, and Samson is not one that I would pick. I was intrigued. I was a little apprehensive, but okay. And then we get to the last sermon. We get to this verse, and he basically just cuts everything off here. And I was outraged. My friend was outraged. You have a room full of 1,000 youth who all have Bibles. They can read what comes next. They are not idiots. Don't lie to youth and don't misrepresent the Bible. If you want to teach something, but to make your point, you have to either omit a verse or omit part of a verse, what you're teaching isn't exegetical. I would question whether or not it's even biblical. He wants Samson to have a positive message, so he omit what comes next. So this is Samson's prayer, and it's very similar to the other prayer that we get. So in chapter 15, after he has killed the 1,000, right, he goes, "You have accomplished this great victory through your servant." Well, that's very pious. And now here at the end, right, in chapter 16, he is going to give us another prayer. "Lord God, please remember me, strengthen me, God, just once more." Well, that also is very pious, right? Okay. And then comes the second part of the verse, the second part of the prayer. So in 15, he goes, "Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So he offers his thanks to God and then immediately asks for something. Okay, God, thanks for what you did. Now what are you going to do for me? Right? Showing how selfish he is, how self-centered he is, and that this really isn't about God or giving praise to God, it's about asking for something. So in chapter 16, he then goes, "With one act of vengeance, let me pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." What is missing here? There's no humility, but there's no acts. He's not asking for forgiveness. There's no, "Please forgive me, I'm sorry." No sign whatsoever of remorse. All there is hate. All there is just anger, and he just wants revenge. I get it. Like, we want Samson to have this great redemptive arc, and it would really be nice if we got that, but we don't, because in the end, Samson hasn't changed. The Samson we end up with here is really no different than the Samson we got 20 years prior. He's the same spoiled kid, just asking God for help, and it's unfortunate, but that's the story that we've got. And God uses him. God gives it to him. So in verse 29, Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars supporting the temple and leaned against them, one on his right hand and one on the left. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the leaders and all the people in it, and the dead he killed at his death were more than those he had killed in his life. Then his brothers and his father's family came down, carried him back, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. So he judged Israel 20 years. Now, we're going to try and wrap this up. We went over, very briefly, the decline of the judges. And we see how the leadership has degraded, from the great Othniel all the way down to Jephthah, who sacrificed his own daughter to save his life. And as things have gotten so bleak, as things have gotten so bad, Israel needs a hero. They need someone who will clean up the mess, who will be the great deliverer. And they end up with Samson, who just smashes through the bottom of the graph, right? I mean, there's not even a place for him. In the last 10 years or so, we have seen the rise of superhero films. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to escape them, right? We've had Superman and Batman and all the Marvel movies and stuff. But with those have also come more subversive films that have painted superheroes in a very negative light. You can call them anti-heroes, you can call them deconstructions, although people who use deconstruction don't usually know what it means, and they call them subversions. The point is, right, we think we want a hero like Samson, someone who has this power, who has all this strength, and we think that he's going to fight for us. We think that he's going to be this great hero, and he's not. So I'm going to appropriate a line from a movie that, so the end of The Dark Knight has a line that's very famous, but it doesn't really make sense in the context, but I think it really works well here for Samson, although I'm going to reword it a bit. Samson was not the hero Israel needed. He was the one she deserved, which should be really scary, right? Because sometimes God gives you what you need, not necessarily what you want sometimes God will give you what you deserve, and not necessarily what you need or what you want. And that's what she got with Samson. And God can use people like Samson. You know, if you pray, like, God, use me, God can use you. That doesn't mean you'll like it. I mean, he might have you in a temple with the Philistines and you're going to die with them. Like, God can use you. So here we have the end of the Judges. And just very, very quickly, we have the last couple of chapters. See, it's easy to look at this, look at the decline of the leaders, look at where Samson ends up and think, this is what's wrong with Israel. And you can talk to people and they go, you know what's wrong with this country? And then they usually want to complain about their elected leaders. I don't care what side you're on, doesn't matter. They'll be like, it's because we elected this person or whatever. Your leaders are not the cause. Your leaders are a symptom. Your leaders are chosen from the people. And often they represent the best and worst of the people. If you don't like your leaders, it's probably because something's wrong with your culture. And that is absolutely what we see. The leaders, the judges, as bad as they get with people like Jephthah and Samson, are not the cause of Israel. They're a symptom. And that's what the last few chapters show us. So in chapter 8, 17 and 18, we get the story of Micah and the Levite. We're finding out that the Levites are spreading cults. They're not doing their job. They're not teaching the people. They're not being faithful to Yahweh. They're literally taking money and starting their own little subcults. We have a religious failure in Israel. Then in chapter 19, we have the famous Levite's concubine, different Levite, where we find out where the Levite goes to an Israelite city, right, and his concubine is raped to death in a story that intentionally mirrors the story of Sodom. And this is a cultural failure, right? The culture has declined to the point where their cities are no safer than Sodom. And we know what happened to Sodom, right? God nuked Sodom. And now Israel's cities are as bad as Sodom. And then it culminates with chapter 20 and 21 with the War of the Benjaminites. So all of this degradation has resulted in civil failures. The tribes are no longer working together to fight the outsiders, to fight the Philistines, to fight all the other people. They're actually fighting. They see each other as the problem. They've turned inward, and now they're fighting each other, creating a civil failure, right? They're killing themselves. This is where Judges leaves us. We have religious failures, we have cultural failures, civil failures, and so that when the book of Ruth begins and says it was the time of the judges, it's a bad time. This is possibly the worst period of Israel's history. And I know this is a downer, but that's where the book leaves us. So, sorry for going over.